It's my pleasure to introduce the three speakers of today's webinar: Andreas Fichtner, Hansruedi Maurer, and Patrick Marty. So the ETH Zurich is under the spotlight today. So on these three researchers have in common a very interesting topic, FWI. So we'll go through several examples of application from FWI. We'll start with a talk from Andreas about global full waveform inversion, so earth science application. We'll continue with a talk from Hansruedi Maurer, focusing on near surface application of FWI. And finally, we'll make an opening of the topic with some example coming from the medicine, so outside of geoscience. So before we start the talk of Andreas, let me say a few words about him. He's a full professor of seismology and wave physics at ETH Zurich. He holds a PhD from the University of Munich, and the subject of the PhD work was FWI for structural and source parameters. His current research topics, of course, are related to FWI, but also high-performance computing, medical ultrasound imaging, and more generally, any types of novel techniques for numerical wave propagation and uncertainty quantification. He's the co-founder of ETH's spin-off Mosaic, and over the years, he won a significant number of awards, and we are listing here some of them. So the Kaiti Award from the American Geophysical Union, the Early Career Scientist Award from the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, and last but not least, the Hoffman Prize from the Bavarian Academy of Science. Thanks a lot for accepting to join us today, Andreas, and feel free to start your presentation as soon as ready. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
And now in full screen?
Yeah, it's in presentation mode.
Yes, okay, perfect. So yeah, first, many thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to present our work here, and for participating and for finding the time at this time of the day. So before I present my own work, or the work of our team, I would like to give you a very brief overview over FWI research here at ETH. Loosely speaking, we are bridging really the scales that one can handle with FWI. So for example, we are working on regional to global scale seismological applications of FWI. This is very often in the context of tectonics and geodynamics, but we're also interested in high-performance computing, the development of numerical methods that improve or accelerate FWI, but also in the development of new nonlinear optimization techniques, methods for uncertainty quantification, and so on and so forth. And some of these topics are what I will talk about in a couple of minutes. Then if you go to somewhat smaller spatial scales, there is FWI research for environmental and exploration applications. This is probably what most of the audience here is closest to. So this concerns topics like near-surface geophysics, but also at scales that are even smaller. For example, lab experiments to test FWI on ground truth structures. And much of this is in the context of natural resources, but also natural hazards research. And this is those topics, or some of those topics, will be covered in the talk by my colleague Hansruedi Maurer. And then at the smallest scales that we are working on, there is basically translational science from seismic full waveform inversion to full waveform inversion in medical ultrasound. So in a nutshell, we are trying to translate what we do to scales of a couple of centimeters. And applications that we are particularly interested in is FWI for breast cancer screening, but also for transcranial ultrasound. And that last topic will be presented by our PhD student, Pat Marty. So this brings me to my own talk, which will be on multi-scale imaging of the Earth as a whole, so at global scale. And the important thing here to mention at the very beginning is that this is by no means just my own work. There's a big team behind that has worked on this topic for many years. And here in particular, I would like to highlight the contributions of Survey Trusterson, Dr. Philip van Herwaarden, and the Mosaic team, so the team in our startup company, and of course, many, many other people. So global scale full waveform inversion. Most of you, as I suspect, are more in the exploration or engineering part of this topic. So I thought I'd start with a few words about the scientific relevance of running full waveform inversion at global scale. Why do we care about this? One big application niche here is earthquake source inversion. So constraining the source mechanisms of earthquakes, including the location, moment tensor, finite source properties, and so on and so forth. And for this, we need accurate three-dimensional models of the Earth. Specific applications here are, for example, tsunami early warning, but also nuclear discrimination. Those global scale full waveform inversion models, they are also one of the major ingredients to global geodynamic reconstructions to learn about the long-term history, dynamics, evolution of the Earth. But also, you may be surprised, global scale FWI models are used for resource exploration. So the model that I will show you towards the end of this talk, for example, is used in diamond exploration, basically to find parts of the upper mantle where diamonds are more likely to form than in others. Now, what are the challenges? Why is global scale full waveform inversion actually a difficult problem? And I think those challenges, they are the same at all scales. We suffer from very uneven data coverage because the earthquakes occur where they occur, and seismometers are typically located in highly industrialized countries, but not in less industrialized countries, not in the oceans, not in polar regions. Nevertheless, we have massive data volumes that we need to handle. So typically tens of terabytes. So this very quickly becomes unpleasant. But all of those challenges, they are by far overshadowed by this third one, which is that the computational requirements scale with frequency to a power of at least 5. And so that at least 5 comes from the fact that part of this exponent that we see here is actually controlled by the data coverage. So in the good case, it's 5, but it can be much worse. So this is difficult. So scaling this up to higher frequencies, meaning to actually exploit the information that we have contained in the seismic wave field, is computationally extremely challenging. So, and for this reason, my talk will focus on methods that allow us to reduce computational requirements, specifically for this global scale application, by orders of magnitude. So we are not interested in a few percent computational resource reduction, but really something that is a factor of 10 or 100. And the first method that I want to talk about are wave field adapted measures. To introduce the topic, I want to show you a toy example. So this toy example is a numerical simulation in 2D. It's 2D elastic, and it runs in a little box that is 600 by 600 kilometers wide. And there's a source located somewhere. And that source excites a wave field that propagates through a medium that you can see here in this panel. And the wave speeds, they are plotted in grayscale. So this is basically P and S wave speed. And you clearly see that there's a slow S wave, a faster P wave propagating through this medium. And we simulate this wave field using a finite element method. And the size of those elements that you see here, this is controlled by the frequency content of this wave. So in order to properly sample a wavelength, you need to have a certain number of elements per minimum wavelength in order to ensure reasonable numerical accuracy. I think this is pretty well known, but what is maybe not known so well is that wavelength is actually an anisotropic property, and it's relatively easy to explain. So when you look at wavelength here, for example, of this P wave, then it is clear that this wavelength is rather short, or the wave field varies rapidly parallel to the propagation direction. However, perpendicular to the propagation direction, so along the wavefront, the wave field actually varies much more slowly, meaning that in that direction, the wavelength is actually much longer. And this anisotropy of the wave field, or of the wavelength, can be exploited to generate more efficient numerical meshes. And this is what you see here. So what you see down here, the same source, the same medium, but now this mesh is wave field adapted. So it is coarser in azimuthal direction, but in radial direction, it has the same grid size. So the interesting thing about this mesh is that it has about 8 times less elements. So 1,250 compared to 10,000 of this element of this mesh that you see above. And this means that the computational requirements reduce by a factor of 10, because that is proportional to the number of grid points. The interesting thing that you see here is that this wave field that we computed with this wave field adapted mesh is for all practical purposes the same as the one that we computed with this regular mesh above that requires 8 times more elements. So this is the forward modeling component. It turns out that you can run full waveform inversion with this. So you can actually solve inverse problems. And I want to show you this first with a synthetic recovery test. So we have 2 scenarios. The first one is we have a regular mesh, like here, with those 10,000 elements. And with this, we try to recover some input model. And what you see down here, this is the model that we recover. And we do the same with this wave field adapted mesh. Or in fact, it's a sequence, it's a collection of wave field adapted meshes because we need one for each of the sources. And then the model that we reconstruct is shown down here. And you see that the 2 models that we reconstruct are, again, for all practical purposes, the same. But the interesting thing here is that for the left one, we required 66.6 CPU hours to achieve a 95% misfit reduction. And with those wave field adapted meshes, we needed only 6.2 CPU hours for the same amount of misfit reduction. So we have a reduction of computational resources by about a factor of 10 for the same result. So that was number 1. The second technique that I would like to talk about are dynamic mini batches. So how does this work? So I jump right into this global scale example that I will also show later. We see here a distribution of 2,244 earthquakes with magnitudes above 5.5 that we can use for global scale tomography. And in a normal full waveform inversion, one would use all of those events at the same time. But this is not what those dynamic mini batches do. What we do there is we pick a subset of those events. And that picking of those events, it's quasi-random. So in principle, we choose them randomly, but we make sure that they still have a reasonably good geographic coverage. And this has 2 positive effects. The first one, it actually homogenizes uneven coverage, but it also helps us to harness data redundancy. Because many of those events, they occur in similar places. And if you pick one of the neighboring events, it doesn't make a big difference, but it contributes similar data. So what is special about the approach that we are using is that we have what is called a control group. So among those events in this mini batch, we have a smaller group shown as the yellow stars, and this is the control group. And then when we go to the next iteration, we again randomly choose events, earthquakes in this subset, but the events in the control group stay the same. And so the other events change randomly, quasi-randomly, but the control group events, we keep them as we go from iteration n to iteration n+1. So why do we do this? The first reason is that it helps us to actually check if the misfit decreases from one iteration to the next, at least for the control group events. But it also helps us to steer the mini batch size, because we try to approach the gradient of the whole batch by the control group. And in case this approximation is good, the mini batch size stays the same. If this approximation is bad, the mini batch size needs to be increased. So there it's more difficult to quantify the reduction in computational requirements, but empirically what we get in synthetic inversions is a reduction of those computational resources by about 75%. So this is roughly the order of magnitude reduction that we are looking for. Now, what we did, we combined those two approaches. So we have an order of magnitude reduction from the wave-field adapted measures. And on top of that, we get an order of magnitude reduction from the use of dynamic mini-batches. And we combined the two to construct this global scale tomographic model that we called REVEAL. The data set I have already shown to some extent. It contains those 2,244 earthquakes globally distributed. This is the majority of events with magnitudes above 5.5 that occurred since the year of about 2010 until now. In total, we have about 6 million complete seismograms in a period range from 30 to 150 seconds. The receivers that we used are shown here. So this is, in total, we had about 30,000. So 30,000 receivers globally distributed provide open access data for seismological research, which is pretty impressive, I find. So in all of this, we combine in this dynamic mini-batch wave-field adapted mesh FWI. And the result is, as I said, this global scale FWI model called REVEAL. I don't want to go into much detail. What you see here is just a part of the model. This is shear wave speed at 100 kilometer depth. And just to illustrate the amount of detail that you see here, this little orange blob that you see here, this is the Lesser Antilles arc. And this little red blob that you see up here, this is the lower Rheingraben, or the upper Rheingraben, not far from where I'm sitting at the moment. So this is in southern Germany, northern Switzerland. So it has a lot of detail. We can also go a little bit deeper. This is at 500 kilometer depth. There the image is dominated by a collection of subducting slabs, for example, here along the Andes. And then as we go deeper into the Earth, this is close to the core mantle boundary at 2,800 kilometers. This, of course, is then dominated by the large low shear velocity provinces. To show you a little bit a comparison. So published only a few months after REVEAL was this model GLAD M35 by the Princeton group. And it's interesting to compare these two models because they actually use very similar amounts of data. But there's a difference. And the difference is that thanks to using wave-field adapted meshes and dynamic mini-batches, we could run 305 nonlinear quasi-Newton iterations, whereas GLAD M35, not doing that, we're only able to run 35 iterations. So a factor of 10 less. But at the same time, even though we used a factor of 10 more iterations, the computational resources that we used were about 2 orders of magnitude lower. Right, so this is a very significant reduction in computational resources. Now that the two models are different in resolution is something that jumps into your eye, but it can be made more explicit by zooming into a few regions. So one of the things that REVEAL does, for example, is to resolve shallow lithospheric structure. This here is at 50 kilometer depth, where you very nicely see the shallow structure below the Andes, the crustal structure, the deep crustal structure, which in GLAD M35 is basically absent. Also at slightly larger depth, 150 kilometers, REVEAL resolves subducting slabs. So for example, here along the Aleutians, which is also absent in GLAD M35. But also when you go deep into the mantle, you clearly see that the strength and the sharpness of those lower mantle anomalies increases quite significantly. Another thing that is interesting to compare is reveal versus a regional scale model. And what you see here, this is a regional scale model of the Western United States, Western US 325. And what you see in the colored image here is a cross-section, depth section through the Western US. So this is a regional scale model, a 1,000-kilometer scale model based on regional scale data. And then when you zoom into reveal, it actually turns out that this looks remarkably similar. So the bottom line here is that we actually have a global scale FWI model, but it achieves regional scale resolution. Yeah, so it's built for the whole Earth, but it is a multi-scale model that bridges regional to global scales. Now let me wrap up. What we have seen are those two methodological developments, the wafer adapted measures and the combined and the dynamic mini batches. And the combination allows us to reduce computational resources by an order of magnitude or more, depending a bit on the data set. And this in turn allows us to exploit more data, perform more iterations, reach higher resolution. Now, we built this reveal model, and that, as you have seen, it bridges regional to global scales. So it's not strictly speaking a global scale model anymore. And what I have not shown, it actually explains independent data at 30-second period. So it has a pretty impressive predictive power. But there are also limitations. One of the limitations is that the methods that I have shown, they're very specific to regional global scale FWI. So at engineering scales, at exploration scales, where the Earth is much more heterogeneous, the wafer adapted measures may not work that well. And what we do not know at the moment is at which frequency for the globe this approach actually breaks down or at least becomes inefficient. And that's all I have. Thanks a lot for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them or at least try. Thank you. Yes, of course. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, but let's continue with the second talk. It's a talk by Hansruedi Maurer entitled Challenges of FWI Applied to Near Surface Problem. So Hansruedi Maurer holds a PhD in geophysics and as well an habilitation doctoral degree in geophysics from ETH Zurich. So among his main research interests, we can mention inversion of diverse geophysical data, and is currently focusing his research on cryosphere application, deep geothermal energy, and nuclear waste repositories. He's working as a professor at ETH Zurich and has co-authored more than 300 publications in international journals and in refereed conference proceedings volumes. He won a significant number of awards as well. The best paper in geophysics award from SEG in 2004, and more recently the SEG Frank Fichtner Award in 2020. So Hansruedi, feel free to start as soon as ready. I don't see you. I'm still online?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure. Just firing up my presentation. So can you see my screen in full screen mode?
Yes, we do.
Okay, wonderful. So after this wonderful presentation from Andreas, I will now guide you through some of the problems that we have in a more shallow environment. And as Andreas, I would like to point out that my name here is really just a placeholder for a large number of people that have contributed to all that research. So let me start with this very basic introductory slide. So, I mean, when you give introductory classes for seismics, so then you have sources shown here with the yellow star, you have receivers, and then you have reflected phases, you have refracted waves, and you have surface waves that are bound to the surface. And when you look at the recordings, then it may look like this. So on the horizontal axis, we have distance, and in the vertical axis, we have time. And then we see the individual phases. So for example, here we see the cone of surface waves, we see refracted phases, and we see reflected phases. And there are specialized techniques for all these different phases. And but the problem is that when you're going to the near surface, then you're basically in that realm. And here, all these phases are on top of each other, which makes things very complicated. It makes it next to impossible to do classical reflection analysis, but it also makes full waveform inversion quite complicated. But on the upside, full waveform inversion is a possibility that we can exploit such data sets when these phases are not well separated. So there could be a very large list of topics that I could list here because there are numerous problems that need to be solved for solving these near surface problems. One might think that looking in the deep earth is much more challenging than looking at shallow structures, but at least in my view, this doesn't seem to be the case, and I hope I'll convince you or explain to you why I think this is the case. So I more or less randomly selected 3 topics that I would like to share with you today. So one is about adaptive trace selection and windowing. So I explain to you in a minute what this is all about. Then we talk a little bit about the topography. And then, so this is one of my favorite playgrounds. I will briefly talk about optimized experimental design in the context of full waveform inversion. So let's talk about adaptive data selection. I assume that all of you are some sort of familiar with full waveform inversion, and then you for sure have heard the buzzwords of non-uniqueness, ambiguity, local minimum, and cycle skipping. And this is indeed a large problem in general, but particularly in the near surface environment, so where you have very pronounced velocity changes and usually not particularly good a priori models. This is particularly severe. So let me explain it as follows. So let us assume that the true trace is the black trace and the onset is here. And now we have an initial model and we predict waveforms, and the initial model needs to be sufficiently close to the true model in order to avoid this cycle skipping. And so this is, of course, frequency dependent, here not shown in terms of frequencies, but in periods. So your prediction of a particular waveform needs to be close enough such that it fits in such a realm here. So if you would have an initial model that predicts this waveform, that will be fine. However, here this initial model or actual model is far away, and such a trace would be prone to cycle skipping, and therefore we have looked at the technique where you're not only doing full waveform inversion, but you also try to fit the kinematics, because this is a general problem. We do not really know upfront as to whether we are prone to cycle skipping or not. And I would like to explain this with a very simple example. So this is a simple setup with a bunch of sources at the surface and a few receivers shown by dots and crosses. Our true model is a model with a linear increase. So we have a surface velocity v0 and then a velocity gradient with depth. And let us assume that the true surface velocity is 1500 meters per second. That's the gradient. Then this would produce these waveforms here. If our initial model is let's say that one. So we have an initial velocity we estimate to be 1600 meters per second and a different gradient. Then we see the following. So these are the actual onsets that we may have picked from, or that we have picked from the observed data that are generated by the true model. And if we superimpose this on the current model, that we see at near offsets, they fall into the range, but all these traces, they are prone to cycle skipping. So this basically, and the technique that we are using here is quite simple. We simply ignore these red traces here until the model is good enough such that they fall into that range. And with this, we can largely reduce the cycle skipping. So this is all shown with that range for one particular frequency. And of course, later on, when we are happy with, when we have fitted a particular frequency. So I also should point out, as you probably know, full waveform inversion can be done either in the frequency or in the time domain. We are usually doing this in the frequency domain, and then we fit frequency by frequency. So let us assume that we have fitted the lower frequencies, and then we go to higher frequencies. And there might be other traces that might be excluded, and we have to do more iterations until this is sufficiently well matched such that these traces can be used as well for the inversion process. So that's one option how we can mitigate this problem of cycle skipping. Then another problem that we have when we are dealing with near surface, we have very complicated waveforms. So I mean here this is for these waveforms, they are for this very simplistic model, but typical seismograms looks more like that. So you have P waves, S waves, surface waves, scattering, multiple scattering, an entire zoo. And this makes it very challenging to fit all these phases with a relatively poor initial model. And therefore, data windowing is a very simple but quite effective technique. So you simply put a taper on the traces with which you blank out these later phases. Of course, when you predict the data later on, you need to apply the same processing to them as well. And then in the course of the iterations, you gradually relax this windowing such that in the end, you will consider the entire waveform. And I would like to show you very briefly the effects. So I have chosen the famous Marmusi model because everybody is using that for showing some methodological improvements. So that's the true model that you know very well. And the initial model is shown here. So we have again a linear gradient model. When we apply now this adaptive trace selection technique, then we end up with, this will be shown in the next slide. When we don't apply any of these techniques and just more or less blindly run the inversion with the typical frequency scheduling scheme, starting with low frequencies, going towards higher frequencies, apply appropriate regularization, then this is the result what you get. And when you apply this adaptive selection technique, then you get already a substantially better image. So when we go forward and backward, so it is clearly getting better. And similar effects can be achieved when you do the time windowing. So when you apply the time windowing, you can also get a better result. And the best result, of course, you get when you do both. So you do the adaptive selection technique and the windowing, and then you receive an image that looks like that, which is quite close to the true model. So that's a very simple and effective method to mitigate some of the problems that we have with full waveform inversion. So let's move now on to a topic which I think is quite clearly near surface related. So for global scale models, the topography is often not so much of a problem, and not so when we are dealing with the near surface. So I'll just realize there is no scale here. So these are just a few tens of meters of the model size. And what we see here on the left, that's our base model with a low velocity layer shown in blue here, then intermediate velocities and high velocities shown in red. And if we would simulate elastic waveforms for a shot, maybe sitting here, then this is how it would look like. We have P phases, S phases, and surface waves. When we now superimpose a few anomalies and recompute the waveforms, then it looks like this. And when we compare the middle panel with the left panel, then we see these individual anomalies, they have a significant effect on the waveforms. So that's good, because we're gonna exploit these differences during the full waveform inversion. If we additionally add some topography, so here this is quite an irregular topography, we compute the waveforms, then we end up with this. And so here you see that the distortions are quite substantial. So I would say that the differences between the right and the middle panel are larger than between the middle and the left panel. So the bottom line is, if we ignore the topography, then we are possibly in trouble, and that this is indeed the case, I will show with the next slide. So we have simulated a variety of topographies shown here on the left column. So the models are all identical. The only thing that is changing is the wavelengths of the undulations of the topography. Here's some long wavelength undulation, intermediate and high wavelengths undulations. And if we do an elastic full waveform inversion and incorporate the topography correctly, I should say that for that we have used the forward solver developed by Andreas Group, which is apparently doing a nice job. We can recover these anomalies quite nicely. Not so when we say, well, these are very small undulations, we can ignore them. So for the long wavelengths, it is not too bad, but still that's a clear degradation of the imaging quality. And when you have more high frequencies oscillations, then you're in trouble. And so the take-home message here is, even when you only have very minor topographic variations of the orders of 1 or 2 meters, this may have an effect, and so you need to consider them when you're dealing with near-surface full waveform inversion problems. So the third topic I would like to talk about is optimized experimental design. And well, that's also an inherent problem of near-surface applications. So when you talk about oil and gas prospection, then there are typically millions, tens of millions around for doing full-fledged 3D surveys. Not so when you're in near-surface applications, where the budgets are often quite limited. And therefore, we have to make sure that we do our surveys in an efficient manner, and we also select data that the full waveform inversion is affordable on affordable computing power. So what is optimized experimental design all about? So it is best explained with the so-called benefit cost curves. So And on the horizontal axis, we have experimental costs. In the example I will show in a minute, the experimental costs, they are related to the number of shot points that we are using for our survey. On the vertical axis, we have the subsurface information that we would like to extract. And clearly, when we have more sources, we get more subsurface information. And what's typically happening is when you increase the number of shots, the subsurface information is increased, but it never goes linearly up to infinity. At some point, it starts kinking, and then it becomes very expensive to get only a little bit of improvement of subsurface information. And this is what we call the area of diminishing returns. And ideally, you would like to be here. So you would like to get most of the subsurface information with the smallest amount of costs. So one tricky thing is, how do we quantify subsurface information? And there are a number of measures around, and this is just one of them. And so it is called the normalized relative eigenvalue range. So here is the equation that you have to solve when you are doing full wave inversion using the Gauss-Newton scheme. So I guess you're familiar with this type of equations. And the key thing here is that this matrix, this approximation matrix J transpose J, needs to be inverted. And the better designed your survey is, the better posed this matrix is. And so therefore, we just investigate the null space of this matrix. So as to whether it is almost invertible or as to whether it has a large null space. And for that, we compute the eigenvalues of that matrix and plot them in an eigenvalue spectrum. And so you see such an eigenvalue spectrum schematically shown down here. So on the horizontal axis, we have the eigenvalue index. And here we have the normalized eigenvalues normalized to the largest eigenvalue. And regardless how many sources and receivers you deploy, you always have a null space. And so even when you make a very detailed survey with lots of sources and receivers, you typically get curves like that. And this is basically your yardstick you would like to achieve. So the question is now, can we take a subset of a full data set and achieve a configuration that produces an eigenvalue range that is coming as close as possible to the optimal case? And then this normalized relative eigenvalue range is then simply you take a threshold value, you measure this distance here, you measure this distance here, and you form the ratio. And this is then your definition of subsurface information. Might be a bit abstract here, so let's make an example. Again, we use a very simple vertical background model, so linearly increasing velocities. This is what we typically have near the surface. We superimpose some stochastic fluctuation to make it a bit more interesting and realistic. And our comprehensive data set includes 131 shot and receiver positions that we have here. In the following, we keep the receivers fixed and we just try to optimize the number of shots. And before we do this, I would like to show you what we achieve in the very best case. So that's again the true model that I've shown before. We always start the full wave inversion with a linear gradient initial model. And in the very best case, when we use all the sources and receivers, this is the result that we get. So, I mean, it is an acoustic inversion, and of course, we committed the inverse crime. So we were using the same forward solver to compute the synthetics. And that's also an important thing for near surface full wave inversion. So the reason why this reconstruction is so good is because we have a lot of heterogeneity in it. And here heterogeneity is actually your friend, because in such a model, the waves, they are bouncing back and forth and illuminate every corner of the model. And therefore, we have such a good result when we use the full data set. But let's now see how we do when we have only a limited subset. And we start now with the following. So here we have this eigenvalue spectrum for the comprehensive data set, so including all sources. So you see that null space is still considerable, but with appropriate regularization, it is solvable. And here we have the distance where we're going to place the shots. So we pick now the first shot, which provides the best value here. So basically bringing the highest normalized relative eigenvalue range. We compute this quotient, plot it here in the benefit cost curve, and then we see which second shot is optimally augmenting this first shot. And so this second shot is placed somewhere here. And we see indeed we go from about 0.4 already up to 0.6. And then we repeat this, we add more sources. For example, with 5 shots, we are here. With 10 shots, we are already approaching the area of diminishing returns. And then with 20, 50, 100 shots, we have constructed this benefit cost curve. And we see that an optimal number of sources is somewhere between 5 and 10 shots. And that's great because such a survey can be carried out quite quickly. Now, let's see as to whether I have just told you nonsense here or as to whether this leads indeed to very good results. And this is shown here. So here is again the true model. And here is the very best model that we can achieve. And you see with a mere 5 or 10 shots, we get a image that is almost indistinguishable to the comprehensive data set. And this basically shows that optimized experimental design is a very valuable tool for full waveform version because you can reduce the number of sources here substantially. And I should also mention, you can use this in a experimental design state where you actually design a survey, but you can also use this in post-processing mode. So for example, when you get a huge data set and your computer is not big enough to invert that, you can use such techniques for selecting subsets out of it. So this is a bit related to these mini batches that Andreas Fichtner has shown to you. Okay, and that's already all. So as I said, I only have scratched the surface. And here I've just listed a few more topics that we are working on and that are of interest and of relevance for near surface imaging. So one of them is source and receiver coupling. So sometimes also typically when you do full wave inversion, you only invert for a single source wavelet and you ignore the receiver coupling. But for this highly heterogeneous near surface areas, the source coupling and the receiver coupling can have a very strong effect on the waveforms, and therefore they need to be considered as additional unknowns in the inversion process. Then also attenuation is an issue. Attenuation is typically quite high, and ideally you do not only elastic inversions, but also viscoelastic inversions. Then often 2D profiles are acquired and 2D elastic inversions are done, but the out-of-plane effects in highly heterogeneous areas, they are very significant. And so we finally came to the conclusion that there is no way around full 3D surveys and 3D inversions. And with these optimized experimental design techniques, we try to design affordable 3D survey layouts, and then correspondingly leads also to the an affordable solution of the forward problem, perhaps using techniques as Andreas has shown before. We were also playing a bit with the model parameterization. So very often the forward discretization and the inverse discretization is the same, but these two different grids, they have completely different properties and needs. And we have developed optimized model parameterization techniques where you only need a very small percentage of the original parameterization to parameterize your problem adequately. So the keyword here is hierarchical parameterizations. using wavelets decomposition, for example. And ideally, you're going to combine all this. So with optimized experimental design, you keep the subsurface model parameterization fixed, but you vary source and receivers. Here we have kept the acquisition geometry fixed and varied the model parameterization. And our actual research is on combination, so that you start with a very coarse model and very few sources and receivers, and then you gradually add more model parameterizations where they are required to, or where your actual design has sufficient resolution. So there is still a long way to go, but in my view, it is worthwhile. And so there will be lots of things that need to be solved, perhaps by some of you. And having that said, that's all. Thank you very much. Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so, I mean, as I've shown, so that's absolutely possible. Of course, I mean, one needs to do appropriate scaling. So, for example, which frequencies should be used. And maybe that's an interesting point I should also mention here. So, as Andreas has pointed out, so when you go to lower periods or high frequencies, then the computational burden explodes. But on the other hand, when you go to lower frequencies, then you gain in terms of computational benefits quite a bit. And so the question is as to whether we can get useful images for these ultra high resolution surveys with relatively low frequencies. There are a few papers in the literature that show quite amazing results with very low frequencies. And I think this is something that needs to be further considered. We haven't done this in detail, but I guess with such approaches, such endeavors should be possible even with affordable computing power. Well, when you do classical reflection surveying, then so you have to make sure that you avoid spatial aliasing. So there are relatively strict rules in terms of spatial sampling. But we also have to be aware that when you're doing classical reflection imaging, so you're not really doing inversion, you just fiddle around with the data until your data look like a model. And that's the big difference when you do full wave inversion. You do an actual inversion. Of course, you have to apply some regularization. You put in smoothness constraints. But when you do this appropriately, then these relatively strict sampling criteria that are required for reflection imaging are not necessarily applicable or not necessary for such inversions. Yes, indeed. The incorporation of attenuation is a bit of a challenge, but I think it is quite doable. So, I mean, it depends a bit. And I think the key thing here is the implementation, how you do this properly. So, because the attenuation is typically frequency dependent, you have to take care of that. But yeah, I would think it should be feasible, but there is a big but. So, and the but is the following. So there will be likely quite strong trade-offs with the source functions, so that it is the attenuation and the source function, the product of it in the frequency domain that we can resolve. And my best guess here is that we can do viscoelastic inversions, but I'm not sure as to whether the attenuation or the Q model that we get out of it is interpretable. So it is more an auxiliary construct, likely influenced or traded off with the source functions. But when we're only interested in the VP and VS or density model, then, well, I wouldn't care. So then as long as I'm aware that the Q model is not interpretable, then that's fine. So as long as it accounts for the anelastic effects during the FWI runs.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is yes, but in a different way. So what can, for example, be done is so when you're in near surface exploration geophysics, you're often interested in P waves propagating through a heterogeneous medium, P to S conversions, and so on and so forth, but less interested in surface waves or ground wall. So what you can actually do is you can construct anisotropic meshes that have a lateral coarsening near the surface. And that still produces accurate P and S waves in the numerical simulations, but less accurate surface waves that you don't care about. And so it's a different way of wave field adaptation. Yeah, so it's not an adaptation on the basis of some prior knowledge of geometry of the wave field, but it's an adaptation based on prior knowledge on what data are useful in your inverse problem and which ones are not. So there are many variations of the theme. Yeah, and if you want to have specific examples or so, just drop me an email. I can show you something. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So okay, many questions. So the first one, is the code available? Yes and no. So the actual spectral element solver is maintained by our startup Mondaik, and that is commercial. The Yes. So the optimization. So for example, the mini batches. This is something we developed academically, and this is available. And it's even published. Concerning anisotropy, yes, this is possible. Actually, the model that I have shown reveal it is an anisotropic model. It has radial anisotropy. The only thing that you need to make sure is that the anisotropy, just as the isotropic 3D structure, are at a level of complexity that roughly maintains this approximately spherically symmetric wave field. Now, when your anisotropy becomes so wild that the wave field acquires a very complex geometry, then it breaks down. But we don't know exactly when. Unlikely. So the reason why it works is redundancy in the data set. I'll say, okay, so maybe I should answer that question differently. It works in cases where you have redundancy in the data set. So for example, we typically have this in earthquake seismology because our earthquakes like to happen in similar locations. So they actually produce information that is not very distinct. Yeah. So that is the prerequisite for this to be efficient. This is not the same as coverage, because if all your events happen in the same place, you have this redundancy, but your coverage is still poor. Yeah. So it's not a coverage it's not a coverage problem, it's a redundancy problem, and these are two different things. So in the example that I have shown, it has absolutely no detrimental effect on resolution. So when you use those wave adapted meshes, what happens is that depending on how strong you do this azimuthal coarsening, you sacrifice a little bit of numerical accuracy. Yeah. So, and basically what we do is we play around, we test, and we make sure that the numerical error that we introduce is significantly below the noise that we have in the data. Yeah. So that's why it actually doesn't play a role. The other part of the question concerns more the problem: what happens when the medium becomes very heterogeneous? Yeah. So, and that goes in the direction of one of the limitations that are listed. Yeah. This method is efficient because it's very, very problem adapted. And it's adapted to problems where the wave propagation is transmission dominated and not reflection dominated. As soon as you go into a regime where most of the data that you exploit are reflections, it breaks down. Yeah. So at the moment, at the scales where we're looking at global scale, but also in regional scale examples, we haven't reached that limit. So yeah, so it's in a way you can see it as a manifestation of the no free lunch theorem. Yeah, so this collection of approaches itself is not efficient. It's efficient when applied to that very specific problem. Mhm. Okay, yes and no. Also here, so what happens is that as you go to more complex models and higher frequencies, the size of the mini batches, since it's dynamic, increases. So basically meaning that's more or less intuitive. When you're at low frequency, all your waveforms look similar, so you have a lot of redundancy. If you go to higher and higher frequencies, waveforms look less similar. You have less redundancy. Nevertheless, the size of those mini batches in our examples was always orders of magnitude smaller than the size of the whole data set. So it is true, it becomes less efficient, but it is still way more efficient than using the whole data set in each iteration. Okay, so the shorter periods, so shorter periods basically means higher frequencies. What happens by excluding them? The same as always, the achievable resolution is lower. Yeah, so that's clear. So what I have shown at the moment is basically reveal going to periods of 30 seconds. We're in the process of lowering this to probably 20, 17, and we'll see, and hopefully resolution improves and we can still fit the data. What's the effect of excluding smaller events? So that effect is non-existent because events with magnitudes lower than 5.5 are not visible at global scale. So there are no data. Mhm. Okay, so maybe the first part of the question, for what is it being used? Yeah, at the moment, so it's used for several things. It's used for earthquake source inversion, locating events, improving moment tensor inversions. It is being used, as I showed, for exploration. So there is a well-known diamond exploration company, for example, that is using the model. Yeah, so these are I would say the three niches where it's currently being used. What was the other question? Did we compare to other models? Oh yeah, extensively. I will. After the questions, I will put a few papers in the chat, and you can see one of those. One is one where we do quite a lot of comparison. It's like a humoristic review of seismic tomography, which is hopefully fun to read. It's currently under review, but it's already a version on archive. And that has lots of comparison. And what you see is that the reveal model is really a very significant step forward in resolution, especially in the upper 200-300 kilometers, but has a lot more detail than other models.
Yes, thank you, Peter. So for this third and last talk of the session, we'll give the floor to Patrick Marty. So we are slowly decreasing the scale of object to be to be analyzed. So we started with global scale imaging of the Earth, and now we are going to explore another form of terra incognita, the inside of the human brain. And so this is the power of the wave physics, huge range of application for non-destructive imaging. So Patrick will present a talk entitled "Full Waveform Inversion in Medicine: Imaging the Human Brain with Ultrasound." After this two seasoned professional, we have now with us a very young one, currently PhD candidate at ETH Zurich in seismology and wave physics in the team of Andreas. So he's currently working to adapt technique from seismic imaging and in order to use them for medical ultrasound imaging. And the end goal would be to image the human brain with ultrasound computed tomography. So his domains of expertise at the moment, spectral element modeling, hexahedral finite element meshing, and the full waveform inversion. So Patrick, if you are already available, I see you online.
Yes.
Feel free to start.
Perfect. Let me share my screen. All right, it's in presenter view.
Yes, we see your slide perfectly well.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Pat Marty. I'm also from the group Seismology and Wave Physics. And today I'm going to go over some of my research where I take techniques from seismic imaging and apply them to medicine. So specifically, looking to see if we can image the human brain using ultrasound. So to start things off, so what is transcranial ultrasound? So transcranial ultrasound is a technique where we surround the skull of the patient with a series of ultrasound sensors, as we can see here. We're going to focus in on one specific ultrasound sensor located here towards the back of the skull. Now, what we do in transcranial ultrasound is that we model the ultrasound wave field as it propagates through the intact skull. The objective here is we want to measure the reflected and transmitted arrivals that propagate through the brain tissue to be able to reconstruct an image of the human brain. Now, one of the key things here with transcranial ultrasound is that we want to image the brain through the intact skull. And to do that, we want to use waveform-based imaging techniques, as was shown in the previous two talks, because the skull influences the propagation of those ultrasound waves so significantly. And so in particular here, we're going to apply techniques like full waveform inversion and the adjoint method to try and come up with these types of reconstructions. So to draw the parallels here between the type of imaging we might do in geoscience with this type of medical application, we can see here on the left-hand side a distribution of earthquakes represented in red and seismometers on the Earth's surface represented in black. And we'd use this type of setup to come up with, for example, the reveal model that Andreas presented in the first talk. So these tomographic models of the interior structure of the Earth. We have a very conceptually a very similar setup within transcranial ultrasound, where we surround the skull of the patient with these types of ultrasound sensors where they act as both sources and receivers. And the objective here is, again, to recover the internal structure of the brain. Now, there's two key challenges that we run into within transcranial ultrasound. So the first one is that we have this really strong impedance contrast between soft tissue and bone, which is pretty similar, again, conceptually, to the challenges that we see in subsalt imaging within hydrocarbon exploration. The second challenge that we run into here is so-called fluid-solid coupling or acoustic elastic coupling between the soft tissues and the bones. And again, conceptually, this is comparable to what we get at the core mantle boundary in global scale seismology. So let's see how we can apply some of these techniques to some numerical problems first. So as was discussed in the previous talks, so here we need to solve the wave equation many times throughout this type of inversion approach. And so we want to make sure that we have an effective technique in place for performing this type of forward modeling. So in particular here, we're using the spectral element method, which is a matrix-free and higher order finite element method. One of the key advantages with using this type of technique for transcranial applications is the fact that we can create these types of unstructured hexahedral meshes, as we can see an example of here on the right-hand side, where we can precisely mesh the soft tissue bone interfaces. So in particular here, we're using the spectral element modeling software called Salvis, which allows us to perform these types of simulations in both 2D and 3D. So as Hansruedi already presented in the previous talk, we can perform these types of inversions in this type of numerical setup, for example, using something like a Marmousi model, which the medical equivalent, or one of the medical equivalents that we're going to look at here, is something called the MITA phantom. So we can see an example of that here on the right-hand side. So the main imaging target that we want to try and recover here is the interior brain tissue that we're going to recover using full waveform inversion. And one of the key assumptions we're going to make to perform this type of numerical inversion is that we're going to assume that we know the geometry and the material properties of the skull within our initial model. Now, there are ways that we could invert for the skull and its material properties separately, but just for the sake of simplicity here, we're going to assume we know this a priori. Now, when we perform full waveform inversion, this is an iterative inversion strategy where we want to minimize the discrepancies between our observed ultrasound measurements and our synthetic data. And again, we need to solve the wave equation many times throughout this inversion procedure, which makes it quite computationally intensive as a result. Now, the general workflow that we follow for this, we can see here in this flowchart, where we first start off by generating our initial model, which in this case contains the geometry of the skull. And we use that to then compute our synthetically generated data. Moving into our inversion loop then, we first start off by calculating the gradients of our misfit function using the adjoint method so that we can update our material properties from our initial model to come up with a revised model. Using our updated model, we recompute our synthetically generated data and then check how we actually improved the fit of our synthetic waveforms when we compare them to our observations. Assuming all goes according to plan, we would accept the model update and continue to the next inversion iteration. If we were to see that our misfits don't decrease, we would reject the model update and tweak our model updates to then recompute our synthetics and continue with the inversion. Now, the key steps where we need to solve the wave equation are denoted here in red. And I think these are also the steps where we can gain a lot of physical intuition about the potential challenges that we run into here in transcranial ultrasound. And so let's take a look at an example of that. So here we can see our initial model that contains the geometry of the skull, where we surround the skull with a series of ultrasound receivers, and in this case, a single ultrasound source placed at the position of the diamond on the left-hand side. If we model our forward ultrasound wave field, as we can see here, we can see that we have this really strong imprint on the ultrasound wave field from just the geometry of the skull. Now, if we continue running this, these wave field snapshots, we're going to save these in memory because we're going to need access to these during our adjoint run. So what we're going to see in a moment is on the left-hand side, we're going to play this forward wave field backwards in time, but we're not computing anything new there. That's the same simulation that we ran before, and we're just playing it backwards in time. In the center panel, what we're going to see is we're going to re-inject our adjoint sources at our receiver positions, and our gradient then is going to show us where the forward and adjoint wave fields are overlapping. Now you'll notice that when we run this, our time axis is reversed, so we're running this backwards in time. And here we can see we're going to do a freeze frame here. We can see that the locations where the forward wave field in the left-hand panel and the adjoint wave field in the center panel, where those overlap, are parts where they contribute to the gradients that we see in the right-hand panel. Let's finish our adjoint computation. We can see here in the gradient on the right-hand side that for this single source position, we're able to very effectively illuminate the tissues that are close to that source position. So specifically, we can see, we can nicely make out the scalp tissue, as well as that we have a little bit of sensitivity in the anterior brain tissue. So what we would typically do is we would repeat this for a number of source positions that surround the skull and stack the results so that we could illuminate the brain from many different angles. So that's for a single inversion iteration. What this kind of thing looks like, if we do this for many iterations, we can then see here. So we're going to have our inverted model on the left-hand side, and for reference, our true expected model on the right. So if all goes according to plan, the inverted model on the left should look quite similar to what we have on the right-hand side. So starting the inversion, we can see here that we first recover the soft tissues in the scalp, since that's where we initially have the highest sensitivities. Now, as the inversion continues to progress, we can see that we're nicely able to sharpen up the features in the interior brain tissue until we're left with this as the final inverted model. And so we can see here that this works quite nicely for synthetic data, but let's take a look at applying some of these techniques to some lab data. So here we're going to look at an example with a tissue mimicking skull phantom. So this is essentially a skull model that is made out of plastic that has material properties that are loosely consistent with what we would expect to see in bone. So here we can see that the back part of the skull here is partially submerged in water, and the interior cranial cavity, which we can't see here, so that's the part where the brain tissue would normally be, is filled with mostly homogeneous gelatin and has two cylindrical gelatin inclusions, which are the things that we want to try and recover here. So in this image, the electronics that we can see surrounding the skull, this is a ring array with 1,024 transducers, where each transducer can act as both a source and a receiver. So the type of data that we get out of this type of acquisition setup looks something like this. So you'll notice this conceptually, again, looks quite similar to what Hansruedi was showing in the previous talk, where we have sort of shock gather representation with time on the vertical axis and angle relative to the source, or essentially our spatial coordinate on the horizontal. And there's quite a bit that we can interpret out of this, but to be able to kind of see what each of the features in this sort of shock gather representation corresponds to, let's take a look at an example where we generate some of this data synthetically, just using a guess of the material properties of the skull to better understand what some of these arrivals correspond to. So what we have here is we have a series of receivers that surround this 2D cross-section of the skull. So these receivers are in blue. And we have a single source position here at the bottom represented in red. So here we have the inner and outer interfaces of the skull. Again, they're approximate for now, and also we just use a guess of the material properties just so that we can qualitatively see what arrivals approximately correspond to what. So if we model our ultrasound wave field here, we're going to represent the time axis in the vertical direction. So we're essentially extruding upwards the signals that we measure at our receiver positions. So we can see here on the right-hand side our transmitted arrival, and on the left here, this was our reflected arrival. And so we can imagine this kind of shock gather representation here that we have projected on a cylinder, that we can unroll this to get the shock gather that we saw on the previous slide. And based off of that ultrasound simulation, there's a number of interpretations from this raw data we can make, which we can see here. So first off, we have the direct arrival through water, which this isn't sensitive at all to the, or this doesn't interact at all with the skull yet. Here we have our reflected arrivals that would propagate away from the source, reflect off of the skull, and propagate roughly back to where the source position is. We have these guided waves, which propagate through the device itself, these transmitted arrivals that propagate through the skull on one side and out the other. And finally, these so-called shadow zones, which appear because of how strongly we're distorting the ultrasound wave field because of how high this material contrast is. So using this data, then, we can perform something like reverse time migration. So reverse time migration shares the same underlying machinery as what we use in the adjoint method, and it lets us come up with essentially a reflectivity reconstruction. And so we have a mock-up here of the lab setup. So again, we have our coupling fluid here, our tissue mimicking skull phantom with the gelatin inclusions, and our ring array that surrounds the skull. And what we want to try and recover here, again, is the inner and outer interfaces of the skull, as well as these two gelatin inclusions. Now, if we perform reverse time migration with the lab data, we get a reconstruction that looks something like this. So here we can nicely make out both the inner and outer interfaces of the skull, as well as the positions of those two gelatin inclusions. Again, this is from the lab data, coming up with this type of reconstruction. So to wrap things up then, so here we've shown this transfer of knowledge of taking techniques from seismology and applying them to medical ultrasound. And so there's a lot of different techniques that can be very nicely transferred from one application to the other. So with things like the spectral element method, full waveform inversion, adjoint method, our reverse time migration, and there's many, many more techniques that are equally applicable in both areas and are kind of scale independent for these types of wave propagation problems. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, I have a question. Okay, go ahead with that. Well, we'll continue.
Yes, so it is definitely costly to perform these types of simulations. What we've seen from some of let's say some of our collaborators or people that we've chatted with at conferences that are creating these types of devices for like on a commercial scale, is that they're able to come up with these full waveform reconstructions on the order of minutes. So that this question of time to solution is definitely extremely relevant. But yeah, as kind of compute resources continue to improve, being able to push this against us on the order of minutes is becoming more and more feasible. But it is definitely a challenge to be able to apply these types of things at that type of scale. Thanks. Yes, yep. Yeah, so there's definitely a wide range of different code or different types of codes and approaches that are being currently explored in the ultrasound community. So yeah, for example, spectral element method, as you mentioned, finite differences. The pseudo-spectral method is also probably among the most widely used in the medical community. What we've seen, for example, with applying the spectral element for these types of problems is that because we have such a high material contrast at the soft tissue bone interfaces, that being able to precisely mesh those using this type of finite element approach is something that allows us to essentially completely negate the effects of things like staircasing, for example, which have become really prominent and something we need to be quite mindful of using discretizations on regular grids. I don't know if that yeah, answers your question. So yeah, there's pluses and minuses to all these different approaches.
Okay, so one thing was about the windowing. So well, this is strongly data dependent. So when you have strong scattering, then you have to apply this a bit more rigidly. And if the data are rather simple, then it is of a lesser concern. So here I would say you have to choose a trial and error approach to use this technique efficiently. With regard to the trace selection, there I guess there is no subjectivity required because you simply guide your selection or not selection of a trace by the cycle skipping criteria as to whether your first break is within a prescribed window or not. So there is no discussion about it in my view.
Mm-hmm. So I guess to the first part of the question with real-time imaging, so real-time imaging has typically been kind of a hallmark of many ultrasound applications and has been a big selling point for ultrasound. Given the compute cost here, I think at the current point of time, it's unlikely that, at least in the foreseeable future, that using these types of full waveform modeling techniques that real-time imaging will be something that's within reach. I think it's going to take quite some time to get to that. The second part of the question was the limited high impedance contrast and anisotropy. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Does limit so I'm just reading the question myself there. Does limited aperture cause problems? So one of the nice things with these medical applications is we have kind of full control over where we can place the ultrasound sensors. So for example, in this sort of 3D configuration, we can surround most of the tissues and we're kind of free to place the sources and receivers where we like, which is quite an advantage here. So I'd say that it plays less of a role there, but it's definitely something we need to be mindful of when designing these types of systems. And for attenuation, so attenuation is also something that we've looked into here. The attenuation and especially the skull is extremely high. So there we're looking at like Q factors in the ranges of, let's say, like 20, 30, 40. So very low Qs, very high attenuation. And it is something that within this type of spectral element approach, for example, that at least on the forward modeling side, we've taken into account. On the inversion side isn't something that we've looked into at this point yet.
Okay. Yeah. So, so if there are no other questions, I think we'll close the session. But before you leave, we just want to give you an overview of next events. So in June, probably July, we will propose you an after-work evening for those living in the vicinity of Paris, of course. And in September, there will be a nurse science webinar. So you get some flavor of earth science today with the talks. There will be some more in September. And for the next GET 2025, the local chapter will propose a technical session as well. So we'll contact a potential candidate for the talks soon. And yeah, for those attending the conference in October, don't miss this technical session. Bon, we will not disclose immediately the topic, but well, you will see it in the final program in October. And thanks all for joining today, and we wish you a pleasant evening. And we hope to see you for one of our next webinars as well. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.